Welcome to Houston Sports Talk with your host, Robert Land.
Thanks for checking into the best Houston sports podcast, part of the Bleav Network. Check out Bleav in Astros with Mike Stanton and Bleav in Texans with Cecil Shorts. Joining me is my co-host, Stephen Kerr, 65 plus years in sports journalism between the two of us. Later in the show, Yordan Alvarez panic and the Astros postseason bullpen reality. But first, Stephen, you've had a couple of days to absorb the Texans fiasco. Has the disappointment subsided at all?
Well, I guess the first question says, do we believe in Texans? You may put that name to the test after this past Sunday. Yeah, Robert, I have had a lot of time to think about it. And a couple things. First of all, this was my biggest fear, that the weaknesses the Texans had were going to be exposed at some point by someone, probably the Vikings. I mean, I had a fear that this might happen. Look, just because you are a 2-0 doesn't mean that you're playing like a 2-0 team. And the Texans haven't exactly been playing like a 2-0 team. Yes, they've gotten by. You know, they got by against the Colts. They got by against the Bears. But it was obvious in both of those games that there were things that were very troubling. The penalties, for one thing, and I know we'll get to that in a bit, but it all came to light in the Vikings game. And look, the Vikings were a 2-0 team too, but here's the difference. They were playing like a 2-0 team, and they definitely proved they are, because now they're 3-0. People are starting to talk about them maybe being in the Super Bowl conversation, as early as it is, obviously, and not the Texans, and with good reason.
They look like the best team in the NFL. Them are the Buffalo Bills, who we're going to get to what they did to Jacksonville a little bit later. But yeah. I mean, yeah, those two teams are surprising everybody. And I'm going to get to the Texans' trashiest position group in a second. But Stephen, could I interest you in a glass half full Texans take?
Yeah, you can, because I feel the same way. I don't know what you're going to bring up because we haven't talked about it. But no, the glass is still half full. But I just think that these weaknesses, that have been on the horizon, they've been exposed, they've been blown open. So now it's, where do you go from here?
All right, this is a glass half full. Maybe nobody's really thought about this, but get excited about the two rookies in the secondary. Not only are we not discussing Kamari Lassiter and Calen Bullock getting beat for touchdowns or a bunch of even big plays 3 games into the season, but check this out. Their Pro Football Focus grades are extraordinary. Kamari grades out at 75.2, Bullock at 70.8. That's really good. And Stephen, on Sunday, Bullock played 83% of the snaps. He's practically a starter right now.
Yeah, he is, Robert. And both of those guys, I mean, we wanted to see what they could do. Part of the problems in the Texans secondary, I mean, we know what most of them are, but the pass rush is really affecting how the secondary has been playing. And let me give you a couple of things here, Robert. Before Sam Darnold's first TD pass to Justin Jefferson, he held the ball for over 6 seconds. Now, I don't care how good your secondary is. I think Eric Murray was on the coverage there. I don't care how good your secondary is. You can't have them hold the ball that long and expect to be successful. On his second touchdown to running back Aaron Jones, he held it for over 3 seconds. So while the secondary does have its holes, you have to say that Kamari Lassiter and Calen Bullock are definitely playing well as you can when your pass rush is not effective.
Well, I got to be fair, because I've also seen stats where the pressures are near the top of the league. I don't see the numbers on Will Anderson that we watched some of last year, but I heard D'Amico in an interview in the last couple of days say, Stephen, that he wasn't really happy with the defensive tackles against the Vikings. He said that they need to do a better job, especially getting some push in the middle. It helps out the running game and other things. So I thought that was interesting stuff from D'Amico.
Well, yeah. And I mean, he was pretty blunt in addressing the defense and, the penalties and the mental mistakes. So, I think these issues will be addressed. The question is it going to translate on the field? And that's what obviously has to happen.
All right. Time to get to this trashy offensive line. And I wondered, Stephen, how the Texans O-line is grading on Pro Football Focus, because the eye test is that they're poor. So let's check it out. Laremy Tunsil, season grade 61.6. Far and away his worst season. I mean, I'm going to go worst season in a while. But let's also throw in 10 penalties and 2 sacks allowed. Since 2018, he's graded in the 70s or higher in all but that injury-riddled 2021 season. So the Tunsil stuff, that worry is real because, I mean, I'm looking at what they grade based on, their grades as this year as opposed to other years. And, they're grading on the same scale, whether you like the scale or not. Now, Kenyon Green, awful, 48.4. Awful. 3 penalties, 1 sack allowed. Juice Scruggs, actually pretty good, 69.2. 2 penalties, 1 sack allowed. Can clean that up a little bit. But Shaq Mason, another poor 56.6 grade, 2 sacks allowed. This was his worst season in years and years and years. Titus Howard, better than I thought, 69.4 with 1 penalty and 1 sack. We can get to the Tunsil mess in a sec, Stephen, but don't they have to seriously consider Kendrick Green, not Kenyon, at one of the guard spots, or at least give him a couple of possessions this week to see if he looks any different than, say, Kenyon or Shaq Mason? Like I said, both of those guys, it's trouble.
Yeah, I mean, what could it hurt? I mean, at some point, you've got to make some kind of decisions if the play is still going to keep like this. And, we talked a lot about Shaq Mason on last week's show. And, you could add Kenyon Green to the mix as well as some of the other guys. And, Robert, basically all those numbers you threw out really were no surprise to me. As sometimes when you look at something, it turns out not to be as bad as you're picturing it in your mind. I wish that was the case here, but honestly, it's just not. I mean, those grades, whatever you think of them, it definitely shows that the Texans' offensive line is still, it's got to be the weakest link on this team right now. And that's really a shame because you've got some of the other things coming together on offense, save this past week, with the great receiving core you had, and when you have a healthy Joe Mixon, what the running game is capable of. But the offensive line has got to do their part in order for that to happen.
I didn't see Tunsil's postgame quote until after our live postgame show. So I want to read what he said and get your reaction. He said, quote, "They tried to make an example out of us. The first 2 weeks we lined up the same with no problem. Now it's a problem. I feel like somebody told them to make an example out of us. Got to call it the same both sides," unquote.
All right. Let me address this in 2 different ways. First of all, Robert, there are too many veterans on this team to have this many mental mistakes that the Texans have had. In the Bears game, they had 12 penalties for 115 yards. I mean, that must have been a clue that something isn't right. So sure enough, they get 11 for 88, I guess. It seemed like it was more than that in the Vikings game. Many of these are from a former offensive lineman who's supposed to be a Pro Bowler. There were 3 penalties called on 3 straight plays. I thought it was 4, but I think I saw a stat where it said 3. That has to change. And look, in Tunsil's case, 2 of them were the illegal formations. I know that the rule's been, is new and a lot of guys are getting used to it. But these guys have had more than enough time in practice, in training camp, to get used to this sort of thing. So I'm just not sure I'm buying all this. And, the false starts have been a problem for Laremy the last few years. And I'm going to throw out something about Laremy Tunsil, Robert, that may or may not surprise you. But here it goes. If Laremy Tunsil continues to play the way he's playing, and if his PFF grades continue to drop that they're obviously dropping, Laremy Tunsil, to me, is starting to become the Texans' Jose Abreu. I mean, think about that for a second. This guy's got a large contract. His play has been declining since last year. I know you can throw injuries into the mix, but regardless, he is not the Pro Bowl caliber player that we've been used to seeing. And it just seems that every week it's getting worse and worse. And these false start penalties are drive killers, Robert. They're taking points or potential points off the board. So Laremy Tunsil is is got to be the biggest issue of this offensive line, bar none.
Yeah, he can complain about the refs, but as has been said the last couple of days, look, you can go communicate with the refs before the snap if you're not sure if you're lined up properly, but it's not just that. I mean, it's a joke that he's talking about that with all of his illegal procedure penalties that he's had, not just this year, but he leads the NFL, I think, over the last 4 years in offensive line penalties. ESPN 97.5's Lance Zierlein said he's heard from good sources over the years that Texans coaches have had to negotiate with Tunsil to get him to practice. 6'10" Seth Payne, an ex-defensive tackle, by the way, has pointed out Tunsil's lackadaisical run blocking on the backside of plays. The effort and body language is garbage. And Stephen, here's the really awful part, and you alluded to this. Despite drafting a potential starting left tackle in Blake Fisher, you literally have no leverage because the Tunsil dead cap hit is $25 million this year and $25 next year. He's just a lazy diva you're sort of stuck with. It's almost worse than Jose Abreu because the NFL, you can't afford to have this type of contract just blown and beat into pieces.
Well, and you just added fuel to my fire. Thank you, Robert, because, I gave this a lot of thought. When I start throwing Jose Abreu into the mix, that's pretty bad. But look, all those things you said just add up. And just like the Astros and their first base situation, okay, they had Blake Fisher, and they tried him a little bit during training camp because Tunsil was out with the injury and he didn't play at all during the preseason. But what do you really have as a suitable backup left tackle? At this point, you don't. And here's the other thing about Tunsil that kind of makes me feel like he's just talking a lot of excuses. He's talked about how sometimes he'll go up to the referee, when he moves his foot before the snap a little bit, and he's, I don't know if he's negotiated with them, but at least has gotten a warning previously, so he doesn't do it. Laremy, just don't do it. If you know the potential of it to be called, just don't do it. I just think a lot of this talk is basically, as you said, it's just talk. He's not wanting to practice, and it's starting to show in the results. I mean, that's the worst part of it.
The breaking news today is that Tytus Howard just deleted his X account, which I guess is probably a good thing because I'm sure it's probably because vitriol that he's facing on there. But, Tytus and Laremy, I want to see you focusing less on social media and start actually considering, working on your game a little bit. And Laremy, how about practicing instead of negotiating your way out of practice? And nobody likes this guy. Nobody has respect for him. Yeah. Texans fans don't have respect for him. DeAndre Hopkins could get away with not practicing. He wasn't doing stupid stuff like this on the field. Laremy, he can't get away with it.
Well, Bill O'Brien liked him. I mean, that should count for something. He's the one who traded for him. So, but no, you're right. I just think that if you're going to be a diva and quote unquote negotiate, you've got to perform on the field. And Laremy Tunsil, just week after week, I just cringe every time I hear a flag thrown and the Texans have the ball, because 8 out of 10, it's going to be a false start on Laremy Tunsil or some other penalty against Tunsil. And the mental mistakes, I mean, obviously, even if you had cleared most of those up, the Texans still would have lost, but it certainly would have made them look a lot better. And they just got to get better at that as a whole, week to week.
I'll remember what you said, though. I'm going to make a note of this. I'm going to start calling him Laremy Abreu.
Laremy Abreu, yeah.
On X. Yeah, we're going to start calling him that. Texans, Jags, Sunday. Jags, just a dumpster fire. We saw what happened against the Bills Monday night. The Texans, Stephen, must beat the Jags by double digits at home. I mean, that's a must this week.
Yeah, it certainly is a must. And I know it's easy for us maybe to say, well, maybe the Jags have a chance the way the Texans looked on Sunday. But I honestly think, Robert, that this team is too well coached not to bounce back in this situation. Well, we're going to find out how good a coach DeMeco Ryans is coming off a loss like this. I mean, this is the worst loss in his era in over a season plus 3 games. I mean, we thought the Baltimore loss in the playoffs was bad. Well, this loss was worse. So at least by point differential, it was worse. So that's what we're going to find out, Robert. Is DeMeco Ryans capable of pulling these guys together and not only coming back and beating the Jaguars, but beating them convincingly at home?
I hope they feel disrespect that Vegas only has them as a 4.5-point favorite. I mean, this is a Jags team that just got killed. They're coming off a Monday night, short week. I get it. It's a division game, but they're 0-3. The Texans are 2-1 by point differential. The Jags are the second worst team in the NFL, just 1 point better than those Carolina, not Bryce Young Panthers. And the Texans, well, frankly, they need to do some stuff with their point differential. They're 26. After the Vikings shellacking, the Texans are worse than the Browns and the Patriots in point differential, Stephen.
Ooh, well, that's pretty mean. That's actually a generous point line, if you ask me. 4? 4.5. It may change as you go throughout the week. But, yeah, Robert, this is a game the Texans need to win, and they need to show that they really are this deep in the playoffs team that everybody's been talking about. Because as we go through the schedule, it's going to get a lot tougher than the Jags. You're going to face some more teams like the Vikings and some quarterbacks the way, like Sam Darnold. So, yeah, this is a big game for them. And we say must win, not because of must win if, they're going to earn a playoff spot, but must win if they're going to get that momentum back and start going through the rest of the season and playing like the team that we hoped they would when the season started.
Let us know what you think. And we're going to definitely take a look at what you guys thought about this last Texans game in the comments. And a quick reminder before we get to the Astros, look for our live Texans post-game shows right after every game this year. Tom Chavaria and I break it all down. He's doing an amazing job. And tomorrow I'm going to have a Jaguars insider to preview Sunday's game. Try to do this every week. And in case you missed it, yesterday I talked Rockets with Will, co-host of the Brado and Will Show. Believe it or not, training camp starts next week for the Rockets. And please support our content by giving us a thumbs up on YouTube, commenting, subscribing for free on YouTube, or check us out on your favorite podcast app. All right, Stephen, where is your Yordan panic meter at right now?
Well, it's not so much panic, but it's definitely concern. Of course, with the Astros, you never really know. They used the old knee contusion thing to start with. Then they finally came out, and I think he said he had a sprained knee. He's definitely going to sit out the rest of the Seattle series. But you only have one more series after that. You got the Guardians, and then the postseason starts. So, yeah, definitely a concern, Robert, that you've got to have Yordan healthy for these playoffs. You know what? I don't care if he sits out the rest of the regular season, if it means that he's going to be okay for the playoffs, because you've just got to have his bat in there.
When the Astros say it's minor, you might as well start working out your death certificate.
Yeah. For all we know, his kneecap actually fell off, and it's going to take them, 2 or 3 weeks to tell us that. Or maybe even after the season, when he didn't play in the postseason, it came out that he actually broke his kneecap. So, yeah, there is that to consider.
You and I talked bullpen concerns last week, and here are some September ERAs right now by the high leverage guys, the guys that matter. Josh Hader, 6.48, although most of that is from Sunday's game, which was bad. Abreu and Presley, they've cleaned it up. Abreu 1.86, Presley 2.86. Both have whips under 1 for September. And Stephen, let's not forget how money those three guys have been in the postseason. Hader's postseason ERA, 1.37. Presley's 2.22. Abreu's 2.66.
Yeah, I'm not really worried about the back part of the bullpen, but it's the other parts of it that are concerning me, Robert, and those numbers illustrate that those three guys, I think, they're going to have it together the rest of the season. But the bullpen has been part of the reason that, some great starts, by some of our starting pitchers have been blown. I mean, with some great performances by Framber Valdez, Hunter Brown on Monday night against the Mariners. He gave up a couple of runs, but and the offense, certainly didn't come through. But the bullpen definitely blew that game open. So that is a concern. The bullpen is still a concern for me. But as far as the back three guys, I've got to believe that when the bell rings for the postseason, that they are going to be ready. They certainly have to be.
Speaking of the other guys, are we getting a better Hector Neris than the Cubs got? Well, I looked into it. His ERA, 3.89, as you and I record on Tuesday afternoon. It's 4.05 in Houston, so a little worse with the Astros.
Yeah.
But if it's any consolation, Stephen, his walk rate is way down, and his whip went from 1.523 to just under 1 with the Astros.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, he certainly isn't the dominant pitcher that the Astros were used to, but I still like the fact that he's back with the club, and when you get in the postseason and you need that leadership in the bullpen, Hector Neris was a big piece of that. and is going to be in this postseason. So, yeah, his performance has been a little bit of an up and down thing, but, he came in and got some key outs in leverage situations. So we just have to hope that, he's going to bring that when the postseason gets here, and that his leadership in the clubhouse and in the bullpen will show too.
Taylor Scott has been trending downward, and then now we're waiting to see if he's going to be back for the playoffs. So he's a question mark. So I wanted to ask you this, Stephen. Are the best options beyond the Astros' big three on the back end for the postseason Brian King, Ronel Blanco, and Spencer Arrighetti?
Yeah, more than likely, especially if they get past the wild card series. The plus is you're going to have a couple of starters that would ordinarily be starting, but they'll be in the bullpen to kind of help mop things up. And those two guys, both of those guys, in fact, are certainly no strangers to the bullpen, because they did it in the minor leagues. And, in Blanco's case, he did relieving when he was with the Astros before they made him a bona fide starter. So I would feel comfortable having those guys in the bullpen when you need them.
They're the best arms, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely they are.
I mean, they've got the best stuff. I mean, you look at the other guys, and it's just journeyman, scrap heap guys for the most part, except for Hector Neris.
Yeah, for Hector Neris. And you mentioned Brian King. He's just been a mainstay throughout most of this season. So you're definitely glad to have him in there. And with Taylor Scott being such a question mark. So it's going to be great to have both of those arms. If you're going to put them in the bullpen, that would definitely bolster and give me more confidence in the bullpen from start to finish, basically.
Yeah, we kind of panic about everything, Stephen, with the Astros. And you look at what's going on right now among the other wild card teams. It's a lot of garbage out there. So you got to feel good about the wild card round when you look at what the other teams that the Astros could potentially play and what their records are recently and how they're doing.
Yeah, I would say so. And I think the Astros could certainly get through a wild card game, but I still just have this niggling feeling in the back of my mind that in order to go deep in the playoffs, that everything is just going to have to come together. And this has been, it's definitely been one of the weirdest seasons that I've ever seen as an Astros fan, Robert. And as you know, I've been watching them and following them since the 70s. So I don't know how deep a playoff run they can go to. But as we know, they can get hot in the postseason. Look at what happened in 2020. It was a shortened season. They shouldn't have even been in the playoffs, but they were, and they got there, and they got to the ALCS. So you can't count this team out until the final out's made.
I've listened to Houston radio, and I've seen social media, and Justin Verlander had maybe his last start at Minute Maid in a regular season game in his Astros career. Let me ask you, Stephen, because the conversation is basically Justin Verlander is the best Astros pitcher of all time. What do you think? You've seen all of it. You've practically watched from the beginning of the franchise.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't think you really could get an argument either way. Like if you said it was between him and Nolan Ryan, how can you say that Nolan wasn't one of the best Astros pitchers of all time? I still would go with Ryan, but look, Justin Verlander, he hasn't performed. He hasn't shined in the postseason as well as you would like him to.
Neither did Nolan.
But neither did Nolan. Exactly.
Let me just throw this out there. 2 Cy Young Awards, 2 World Series championships. He was incredible as long as he has not been hurt. The seasons he wasn't hurt outside of this year, he was fantastic. And the numbers are just better than Nolan's numbers if you look at
them. All across the board, they certainly are. So, I mean, it's a great question, and we can debate it. You probably never have a true answer unless you just looked at the numbers.
I would take Mike Scott over Nolan in his prime Astros years, to be honest with you.
Well, Mike Scott, I mean, gosh, when you talk about the postseason, oh man, and even in the regular season for a number of years, Mike Scott was definitely the man.
Isn't Roy O maybe the second best Astro pitcher? I mean, was he better than?
Well, when you're talking about across the board and in the postseason, yeah, he's definitely in the top 3 too. Oh, absolutely. So, Justin, I mean, you can't really argue with that, with his only blemish just being the lack of consistency in the postseason. But as you said, he has 2 World Series titles, and all those Cy Youngs. Well, they don't give it to just anybody. So it's sad that Justin is not the Justin that we're accustomed to seeing. And he's even acknowledged that. He's acknowledged that he's not where he wants to be. So it is a big question mark of whether he's even going to be included on the postseason roster. And if he's not, as sad as that is, Robert, it's just understandable the way he's been pitching lately.
I think, there's a potential that he could still make the postseason roster just because we talked about the other guys that the Astros have, the other arms in their bullpen. And, would you rather in a big situation late in the game bring in Justin Verlander or Caleb Ort or Caleb Ferguson or, Sean Dubin or Seth Martinez? I mean, it's a bunch of just dudes, they're just a bunch of Joe Blows out there.
Well, I think when you would see Verlander, the wild card series might be the time where you would not. And if that's the case, maybe a little more rest would just help. It would make the difference. But when you get deeper into the playoffs and you've got, the 7-game series going, that's when I think you could certainly see him because, with the depth being tested this whole year, with all the injuries the Astros have had and the ineffectiveness and just the inexperience with some of these arms in the postseason, regardless of how effective or ineffective Justin has been, he's got that veteran presence and he can still give you a good performance. He at least has the potential to. So I'm not saying that you won't see him at all during the postseason, but if anything, the time to rest him might be that wild card series.
All right, I'm going to switch gears and talk about something I didn't realize we'd be talking about right now, but Tillman Fertitta is trying to get a NHL franchise to Houston. NHL owners are meeting soon to discuss expansion. Houston and Atlanta are the two leading candidates. The Chronicle's Jonathan Fagan reported renovations are underway at Toyota Center to make it hockey ready. For those who don't know, Stephen is a reporter and editor for the Hockey News. What else can you tell us, Stephen? Is there hope on this deal?
Well, this is not the first time this subject's come up, Robert. It's been coming up for years, and Tillman Fertitta has repeatedly said, yes, we would like hockey in Houston. And I do think it will eventually happen, Robert. But, here's the thing. Houston has been passed over a number of times for teams that have already tried the NHL, and they get a second shot. And Atlanta is one of those teams, by the way. You had the Atlanta Flames. They moved to Calgary. You had the Atlanta Thrashers at one point. And now we're hearing Atlanta is up for a third team. So, this is not a hook, line, and sinker thing. And, here's the other thing, though, that could help Houston. The NHL right now has 32 teams. They've got an even number. So if you're going to expand, it makes sense that you would expand with 2 teams, not 1, because it's awfully difficult to have 33 teams or an odd number of teams in a league. So if there is talk of expansion, and, there is always talk, and the NHL is always willing to listen, but they haven't indicated lately that they're really seriously thinking about it. Now, the new team this year, the Utah Hockey Club, and yes, they are called the Hockey Club because they don't have an official name yet, they moved from Arizona. They were the Arizona Coyotes. So they are not an expansion team. That was a team that moved. So there is the potential, Robert, to answer your question, that Houston could be in the mix for an NHL team. I certainly think they should. And if they're going to just choose between them and Atlanta, Atlanta's had 2 cracks at it. Why not give Houston a shot? There are plenty of Canadian transplants that have moved there. Yeah, they've certainly had hockey before with the minor league teams that have moved, but not the NHL. It's a totally different story.
Yeah, I always find it funny. People are like, oh, there's all these transplants, and they probably liked hockey in the city that they were at, but they're transplants, so they still don't have that Houston attitude. Like, I'm a Houstonian and I want to go root for Houston teams and stuff like that. Now, maybe they would come because their team's playing against the whatever the Houston team's called or whatever. But I don't know. I really think what would benefit Houston as a hockey team is, can we get these games played in summer, Stephen? Because everybody would want to go there in summertime. Man, I'm hot. Let's go to a hockey game.
Yeah, well, I guess you could say that in Dallas and Florida and just about everywhere else. But, they have become hockey hotbeds. And there's no reason that Houston can't become one, too. And I think a lot of it, too, Robert, it's also how you develop the game at the grassroots level. And that's something, Houston has a pretty strong girls hockey program, but I don't know that their youth hockey program is as good as it should be. And that's one of the reasons that some of the other cities in the South, like in Florida and Dallas, for instance, I think have had great success getting hockey teams there. But it's a great discussion. And unfortunately, it's been going on for a while and it just hasn't happened yet. But as a hockey fan myself, gosh, I'd love to see a hockey team back in Houston because I followed the Arrows and the World Hockey Association back in the 70s, which was the NHL's rival, to those that don't know what that is. I really didn't follow the minor league teams that much that came after, but I would certainly follow an NHL team there.
Yeah, and if you missed it, I'm going to put a link up. I'll put it up at the end of this on the YouTube video. I'll have a link of our interview with Jack Stanfield, who played for the Houston Aeros, played with Gordie Howe in the 1970s. Gordie Howe is the legacy of Houston hockey, kind of a pretty cool legacy to bring along into that. So we'll have that link. But yeah, hopefully he could gives us something else to talk about for sure, Stephen. And also, someone's working on that WNBA team. So bringing back the Comets is a potential too.
Well, and honestly, as much as I hate to say it, and well, I shouldn't say hate to say it because, women's basketball, hey, it is the sport right now that is growing leaps and bounds. And the WNBA, they should be back in Houston too. Quite honestly, I think you will see a WNBA team in Houston before you see an NHL team.
I don't know how long that would take, but you want to get it in now because the Caitlin Clark era is now. And that's what everybody's excited to go see. And I think it's ignited the league. She's sort of like the Michael Jordan, or the closest that we've had of a Michael Jordan to sort of change the WNBA the same way that Jordan, or, you go back further, you could say Magic and Bird. But, if it's like one person, it was Jordan, and Caitlin's got that it factor right now.
Well, now let's take it a step further because you have Angel Reese. I mean, you could talk about, the Bird Magic rivalry. Well, listen, the Caitlin Clark Angel Reese rivalry is dead on and hot as anything this past year, sniping at each other and things like that. So you've got that in the WNBA to go on.
I would say, though, aesthetically, she's not Bird, Magic, Jordan to watch. I mean, they were like otherworldly passers, and visually, with their passing and their just team game, it was magnificent. And of course, what Jordan and Caitlin Clark can do individually, Caitlin, I wouldn't even compare her as a player to Jordan. Obviously, she's more of like Steph Curry, but that's the equivalent, is more like what Jordan did as an individual. Yeah, they did sort of have the rivalry in college. We'll see if that develops in the NBA.
Yeah, well, it has to some extent. And I mean, it's more on the court. You're right, Robert. You're absolutely right. But there's definitely some blood running between those two that, when social media gets a hold of it and everybody starts talking about it, it can certainly become conversation as far as the WNBA is concerned.
All right. So it should be fun next week. We've got Astros playoffs. I say Astros playoffs. Right now they haven't clinched it, but I'm going to say Astros. We're going to have Astros playoffs. I'm just going to say it out loud. You can blame me later if something happens.
Pretty certain they're going to get there.
Rockets training camp, Texans, big division game on Sunday. So a lot going on next week, starting with Sunday, really. Stephen and I will be handling all of that stuff. And of course, Tom's going to be doing the post game with me on Sunday. So stay tuned for all of the stuff that we've got. Good to catch up with you, Stephen. And we will talk again next week.
You're listening to Houston Sports Talk.
Hey, don't forget to support us by subscribing and commenting on YouTube. You can always listen to us on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast app. Tell your friends about us and share our show links on social media. Spread the word, everybody. Thanks for listening.